When we begin the game Bloodborne, having undergone a medical procedure in Yosefka's clinic, we don't embark on our quest to hunt the beasts of Yharnam's Victorian streets, equipped with the long rifles and sabers that were the Western weapons of war of the 1800s. Our enemies have them, but we don't. Instead, we're given the choice of an axe, a saw, or a cane. But have you ever wondered why? Why did From Software give us these weapons at the beginning of the game? And why was the Saw Cleaver chosen as the signature item for this title, appearing on the game's cover and in its opening cinematic? In this episode of Bite-Sized Bloodborne, we'll peruse the game's weaponry and see how the armaments of Bloodborne are an important slice of the game's medical narrative. In our initial visit to the Hunter's Dream, we're able to choose a supporting firearm and one of three primary weapons: the Hunter's Axe, the Saw Cleaver, or the Threaded Cane. Because these are the first weapons we're able to obtain in the game, and because for many players they'll become the main, if not the only weapon they'll use during their first playthrough, it's worth exploring why From Software decided to give us these particular implements. Obviously, axes have been used in civilizations around the world, including in battle, and they're present in countless fantasy role-playing and adventure games. But that's not the case with the Saw Cleaver and the Threaded Cane. In terms of real-life weaponry, be it of the Victorian era or before, saws and canes weren't used on the battlefield. So what gives? Did From Software decide to feature these weapons simply because they thought they looked cool? I think there was a lot more thoughtfulness and intentionality than that. For us to understand why these items are so conspicuous in Bloodborne, we have to look once again to the game's medical metaphor. As I argued throughout my series, An Agony of Effort, The True Story of Bloodborne, Bloodborne is a massive allegory for the evolution of medical science and practice in 17 and 1800s Great Britain. From Software uses hunters as a metaphor for the surgeons and anatomists of the period, while beasts are a metaphor for surgical patients and cadavers. When we keep in mind these prerequisites, FromSoft's decision to include a saw and a cane among the game's introductory weapons seems very clever, intentional, and appropriate. To see why that's the case, we need to study how these items were used in the real world of the 18th and 19th centuries. Our inspection of the Saw Cleaver has to begin with a historical review of the bloody operating rooms of yesteryear. Surgery in the Georgian and Victorian eras is almost unimaginable when viewed against today's standards. Until the very late 1800s, surgery was often a last resort, undertaken with the clear understanding that the process would be unbelievably painful and likely to result in the patient's death from either blood loss or sepsis. Moreover, prior to anesthesia and sanitary surgical techniques that came about in the mid-19th century, physicians had few legitimate options at their disposal when it came to surgical interventions. Operating on the internal organs was a rare undertaking because it was a virtual death sentence for the patient. And because precision internal surgeries were beyond physicians' abilities and available technology of the time, the most common surgical procedure of the 18th and 19th centuries was amputation. Amputation was the inevitable resolution to any number of injuries, war wounds, and physical maladies for centuries. Compound and comminuted fractures of arms and legs, often caused by crushing injuries, meant the loss of a forearm or a lower leg. The same went for appendages afflicted with gangrene or severe blood clots. The procedure could be chaotic, often requiring 3 or 4 men to hold down the patient while the physician used a knife to cut through the soft tissue and expose the joint or the broken bone. From there, he would employ a different tool to finish the job: a bone saw. Because amputations were by far the most frequently performed operations of the 17 and 1800s, physicians in Great Britain and North America earned an unflattering but appropriate nickname: Sawbones. The Sawbones moniker might have been used as early as the 1680s, but it was part of common parlance in the 1800s, even appearing in popular literature including R.L. Stevenson's Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in 1886, and Charles Dickens' Pickwick Papers in 1836. Old Sawbones was also the slang term for military surgeons during the U.S. Civil War who were believed to have performed more than 60,000 amputations. A battlefield doctor of the mid-1800s, much like their predecessors of the prior century, didn't need to be a masterful artist to remove a tattered arm or leg. They simply needed a strong constitution, a curved knife, and a bone saw. Items that were more like craftsmen's tools than precision instruments. This might very well be why the early hunters of Bloodborne operated out of the hunter's workshop, a term much more commonly associated with woodworking. Much like a craftsman uses a saw to cut wood, the hunters used saws to cut down beasts, and surgeons used saws to cut through bone. It makes perfect sense that the most primitive weapons of Bloodborne, those of the old hunters, are similar to the primitive operating tools of old surgeons. The cleaver, equipped with saw-like teeth and almost completely covered with medical bandages, is inspired by the bone saws that early surgeons used. It's a massive clue dropped into the beginning of the game to help establish the medical metaphor. We later come to learn that the old hunters mused that beast blood crept up through the leg. This, we're told, is why the hunters took certain precautions with their attire, including the tightly tied belts just like the tourniquets that would have been used during real-life amputations of lower legs. It's no coincidence, none whatsoever, that Gehrman is missing a lower leg. It's an immediate signal to us that his leg has been amputated. It's the single most distinctive feature of arguably Bloodborne's main character. It's a flashing red light to help us identify the game's medical metaphor. If you think I'm reading too much into this, then tell me why there's a drawer full of antique bone saws at the foot of the workshop in The Hunter's Dream. The medical references are everywhere in this room. If beast hunting is a metaphor for surgery and dissection, as I've argued, then the description of the saw cleaver and that of the saw spear only underscores this idea. It states, "The saw, with its set of bloodletting teeth, has become a symbol of the hunt." Just like a bone saw is symbolic of amputation, the saw cleaver and saw spear are symbolic of the hunt. While the saw-like weapons that we obtain are easier to connect to Victorian medicine, they aren't the only ones inspired by surgical implements. A weapon we obtain in the DLC, the Beast Cutter, might be even more overt in its surgical imagery and diction. This item, used by the oldest cadre of hunters, slices through the toughest of beast hides. If we swap out just a couple of words in the Beast Cutter's item description, the surgical imagery leaps off the page. This crude implement relies on brute force and is regrettably inelegant, suggesting that the operations of the earliest surgeons made for horrific affairs, painted in sanguine blacks and reds. It's almost impossible to see this as anything other than a reference to early surgery and amputation. Another of the old hunter weapons of the DLC, the Beast Hunter Saif, with its uniquely curved blade, appears to be inspired by the curved blades used in the 18th century to cut through flesh as the first step of an amputation, prior to sawing the bone. The item description even seems to allude to this order of operations, as this curved blade, quote, was later replaced by saws. The curved blade came first, followed by the saw, just as in an amputation. The evidence indicates that From Software designed the Saw Cleaver with an eye on the bone saws of early surgeons. By featuring this item so prominently in the opening cinematic, on the game's cover, and as one of the first 3 weapons available to players, game designers were giving us a massive hint about the central medical metaphor of Bloodborne. It's certainly reasonable to assume that the threaded cane, like countless other items and features in the game, is a contextual device. Just like the horse-drawn carriages, the Georgian architecture, and the antique firearms, all of which nest the game in the 17 and 1800s, the cane could be one of many scene-setting weapons, items, or environmental pieces. But there's much more to it than that. While it's true that the cane was a popular accessory for wealthy gentlemen of Victorian England, It didn't just pop up overnight. We have to understand the historical origin of this phenomenon. Nearly 400 years ago, a specific group within Britain's elite began to carry the cane as a status symbol. It was physicians. The trend began in France, where men of the more scholarly trades stopped carrying a sword and instead touted the handheld cane to signify masculinity and intellectual sophistication. In Great Britain, however, the cane was synonymous with the physician, much like today the white coat or stethoscope is symbolic of the profession. As the Royal College of Physicians of London noted in a 2014 article, from at least the beginning of the 17th century to the end of the 19th, physicians were thought of as inseparable from another accoutrement, their canes. 19th century author John Cordy Jefferson described the ubiquity of canes within the medical profession of the 16 and 1700s. In his 1861 publication, A Book About Doctors, Jefferson writes, "No doctor of medicine presumed to pay a professional visit, or even to be seen in public, without this mystic wand. It was an instrument with which every prudent aspirant to medical practice was provided." Although the cane was largely symbolic of intellectualism and later medicine, it wasn't without its practical applications. Canes were often crafted with a hollow shaft or small compartment at the handle, which commonly held pungent vinegar or a cordial that a physician could inhale or drink in the hopes it would protect him from contracting whatever illness was plaguing his patient. Because many early doctors were quacks who touted bogus cures for any number of ailments, the cane-sniffing physician was lampooned in the satirical etchings of 18th century artists, including Thomas Rowlandson and William Hogarth. While canes were emblematic of 1700s medicine, they were previously employed by a special segment of the medical fraternity of the 16th century, the plague doctors. These physicians, who treated the sick in the larger cities of Europe during outbreaks of bubonic plague, carried short wands or canes that allowed them to poke and prod patients without making direct contact. Much like later doctors did with aromatics hidden in the compartments of their canes, plague doctors stuffed their beak-like masks with herbs to help filter miasmic air that was believed to carry disease. As many others have pointed out, the crow-feather attire set with its beaked mask is almost certainly a reference to these plague doctors of yore. The medical references in this game truly are inescapable. By exposing the real-life inspirations for the Saw Cleaver, the threaded cane, and several other weapons wielded by the old hunters, we're able to see how these figures fit into the game's medical metaphor. The old hunters represent early surgeons, those who performed the most basic and brutal operations. In the Bloodborne universe, the old hunters eventually gave way to the hunters of the Healing Church, who are explicitly called doctors and represent the physicians of later eras, practicing internal surgery and using medicinal agents for experimentation and research. This is what I mean when I say that Bloodborne is an allegory for the evolution of medical science and practice in the 17 and 1800s. The medical metaphor is real. We just have to open our minds to it. Thanks for watching.